Now, this was sort of the interesting revelation for me this morning, this notion of sort of community. I've often said that, and again, in this really black and white kind of put things in boxes kind of way, that comedy is about community, about society. It's always about the society that's in. And one of the reasons why comedy is so difficult to sort of translate generationally, or even from last week, is that, life changed, or something else happened, or some other tragedy, or some other politician did something stupid that Jon Stewart has to talk about, right? Even though that always seems the same, I think politicians have been saying stupid things for a really, really long time, since there have been politicians, and you just know in those Aristophanes plays that they're picking on the same kind of thing that, we know about. It's just the names are so funny sometimes, you can't figure out who they're really talking about. But, so it's always about society, and that's why it's difficult to sort of have them last, unless they're very specific in physical comedy. I think we talked about this before. Why a Moliere lasts is it's so physical in a way, right? That is a different thing, versus something that's very verbal. And the jokes are about current events, because the current events have changed. And unless you have the old pop-up dramaturg who says, this is funny because, and completely mess with the rhythm of a play, as fun as that would be, they're very hard to translate, which is why we always have this interesting challenge about comedies. And we also have talked about the wide range of comedies. My theory that 95% of all dramatic literature is comic, and that very, very little of it is actually tragic. I think we would all agree on what's tragic. I think we would not all agree on what's funny, which is why there's all these different gray areas about it, which is kind of fun and cool, right? And tragedy being about an individual within a society, of course, but it's about an individual, and so it seems easier to translate generationally or historically over time, because King Lear is King Lear. He's still a dad. He's got the three daughters. He's CEO of the corporation, whatever kind of analogy you want to make to it, and that he still does a stupid thing, and there's still consequences for that. And that it doesn't kind of matter if I know the ancient law of wherever he is, and whatever time frame it is. It kind of doesn't matter, does it? And we're still going to watch the consequences of action of an individual kind of go through, and in some interesting ways, of course, Lear represents a different kind of tragedy, or a more complex tragedy, because he has that sort of revelation before he dies. That's not true of all these tragedies, and certainly I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true of Julius Caesar, and maybe not even true so much of Hamlet, a little bit, but not the same kind of revelation that happens for both Othello and King Lear, actually. Interesting. I just thought about that. Anyway, what's interesting about this notion of community that came to me this morning in doing some research is that Christopher Booker said, is it Booker? I think it is. I don't remember. Anyway, somebody said, it's got quotes. It's somebody said, that remember we've talked a lot about sort of journeys of things, where you start something, where the turning point is, how you end. I mean, they're that simple, the way these are structured. We've often made them very, very complicated. The reason they're complex is because of the different lines that all do the same thing. Poetry starts in one thing, has a turn, something. Thematics have a start, a middle part, an end, right? Any kind of meaning that's built in the multi-level meaning of a play anyway. It is the most complicated, in my opinion, the most complicated kind of human communication system. I mean, it's a lot easier to just stand in Hyde Park and just kind of say your point of view, you know what I mean? Versus trying to write a play that so many people have to collaborate in and so many people have to agree to want to share in that kind of thing, right? And there are just so many different ways that we have information, and we have even more now because of the use of technology, much more than I think happened 400 years ago. And all of these things have their own journeys as well, and that's why they feel so complex. But it's not actually complicated. It's very simple. And so for the tragic hero to be somebody who is part of a community at the beginning, something happens and bit by bit is pulled out and isolated, is an interesting way to sort of look at that journey, and that it's not good to have somebody isolated, right? Social means two. This is, one may be the loneliest number, but society at the very has to have two. And so it may just be that this isn't really good that anybody gets kicked out of the nest for whatever reasons, whether by choice or by their own actions, that actually you still have to kind of hold everybody in. It's interesting to think about kicking Shell out. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
In an interesting sort of tonal way. And that was kind of an interesting thing to think about. Macbeth is part of that community at the beginning. Is he not? He's one of those things.
Yeah.
And then gradually pulls himself out for obvious reasons. And who wants to have a dinner in their honor at the Macbeth castle, right? That's not a good thing. So you can see that they're going to be socially isolated very quickly. And same thing happens with Brutus, right? Is he not part of, I mean, he may be grumbling a little bit because we start the play. It's not like we have to have a lot of preamble about it. We're starting the play, he's already have an attitude about something that we've just seen, right? We've just seen, then you have an attitude, boom, the play started. But he's part of that community, he's still part of that world. He's part of that Senate. He's part of the decision makers. He wants to be active about how we're going to rule, how we're going to be, who we're going to be, what we're going to value, what kind of society we're going to, right? I mean, he's still part of that. But as the play goes on, bit by bit, he gets pulled out of it. And I think that's a really interesting sort of way to look at tragic hero. That's not necessarily the way a comic hero keeps trying to get in there. Still wants to be a part of that club kind of thing. It's just interesting. And I hadn't really thought about that till this morning, so it was really pretty interesting. Oh, this is odd, I think. Because, and we've talked a lot about beginnings, right? Those first 80 or 90 lines. I mean, this thing starts with a crowd. So community is huge in this play. And how that has its own arc and progress as well is also something, again, part of the complexity. Not necessarily, but, complexity, not necessarily about the complications. Okay. So, three groups of people, just to sort of give you a sort of sense of how these things kind of begin to interact as material use for writers, structure. This definitely is on. That there are societies, and that's something I belong to, the society of, whatever. It's defined by its function, right? Then there are communities, which is something I join, right? And then there are crowds. Crowds. There we go. And that's something I add to. Right? So you can, there's a little bit of dynamism in all this, isn't there? And there's a lot to be said, especially like the Coriolanus and Julius Caesar. We talk a lot about sort of the power of the crowds. And one of the reasons why Coriolanus becomes so interesting in a presidential election year, which is we've strategically produced it the last time in 2008, was to sort of say, hey, look how easily swayed the crowd is. Just have a 30-second ad with a bunch of lines on it and everybody's going to vote the other way. Right? Sort of the power of that. And so that kind of dynamic, theatricalized in a compressed way, is some of the dynamic that I think Shakespeare's using, even with the 12 to 15 or 17 people that were actually on stage, that they still created a crowd, that there still was sort of an intensity about that, and that Julius Caesar starts with this kind of crowd thing. There's obviously something to be dealt with, starting with a crowd, and we're ending with a couple of people in a tent. Even though there's a whole crowd around them on the battlefield, we're ending with a couple of people in a tent. Right? It's sort of it has its own sort of emotional journey as well, right? And then the whole notion of when does it become a mob, which according to Auden was just, as long as you have passion about something, you're a mob. If you're just sort of milling about, you have no passion, you're just, in the subway, crammed like sardines, that's just a crowd. But the minute you have passion about something, you're a mob. Which I thought was kind of great, right? And you're setting out to do something, and the mob has we'll see next week how often the mob kind of shows up and sort of pushes things forward, sort of in that sort of nobody's in control kind of way, right? It seems very believable. Last time you were at a rock concert or something, sometimes that stuff gets kind of scary. Yeah. Okay, so it's just still something to think about in terms of community and who's in, who's out. This notion of the individual that tragedy often deals with, trying to negotiate around the society as they're trying to change it as well.